This is Ben May, and I want to thank you for joining us as we continue to seek the old past. We have been studying in the days of the judges, the conquest of the land and the period of the judges. And I appreciate you spending this few minutes now as we continue to look into God's Word. If you have your study guide, then we're going to be beginning on page 13. As you can tell, we are just getting into our new book. And I encourage you, if you have not already done so, to order your free copy. We'll get this right out to you, and I believe it will help you in your understanding of God's Word. And certainly it'll help you as you follow along with us. And so as we start on page 13, what you're going to notice now is you're going to see some strange sounding names if you're not that familiar with them, or even if you are, they sound kind of strange because they're just not something we come across in our neck of the woods, you might say. We talked last time about the layout of the land, and we went into some detail about that. And I hope that was helpful to you. Now we want to talk about the inhabitants of the land. As you might imagine, as the children of Israel now, they are poised to cross the Jordan River and to go and to conquer the land, but there are people there. And they've been there a long time. Now the reason that God is going to allow them to take somebody else's land is because of the people of the land's wickedness. In fact, several hundred years earlier, when God was talking to Abraham, and he was telling Abraham back in Genesis 12, and especially in chapter 15 of Genesis, that he was going to give his descendants this land, the land of Canaan. But he said, not now, because the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. Now sometime one particular tribe of people of Canaan would be, their name would sort of represent the whole. Sometime the Canaanites, sometime the Amorites, and so on. And so when God was talking to Abraham, he mentioned the Amorites. Now there were more peoples than that. As you look at your study guide, you'll notice various tribes. Now you have the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And there could be some others that might be mentioned, but these were the ones that we most often hear. And these were not nations like we typically think about a nation. They were more like tribes. We hear a lot about tribes, don't we, as we hear about the problems in Iraq. And you have the various types of Muslims where you've got different tribes. And they are, have more or less, sometimes they are in agreement with each other, and sometimes they are at war with each other. But they were not nations typically as we think about them. Most of them descended from Canaan, who was the son of Ham, the son of Noah. And that's why they are most often referred to as Canaanites. Now remember, it was Ham who had a curse pronounced upon his son Canaan, because Ham looked at his father's nakedness. And that's in the story of Noah. And it was said they would be the servants of his brothers. And so we find this happening now when the Canaanites are going to be conquered by their brothers. As we go back in the Bible story, the descendants of Shem would be the Israelites. And so the Canaanite and Amorite again may be used for both a collective sense and an individual sense, depending on the context. You just can tell that from the reading. Now here's a map that I hope will be helpful to you as you think about where all these people might have lived. Now remember, some of these people were nomadic tribes, and they may not just stick to this one spot, but generally here's a map that'll tell you where they are. Remember, the first city that they're going to conquer is going to be Jericho. Now, as you find Jericho just above the Salt Sea, they are right across the Jordan now to the right of Jericho, and getting ready to go in. They had already conquered Sihon and Og and those kingdoms on that right side, but they're going to cross the Jordan just east of Jericho. But notice now, as you sort of use that as a reference point, just above Jericho are the Hivites or the Hivites, and you've got the Jebusites down below Jericho. You've got the Perizzites to the north. You've got the Canaanites next to the Great Sea there, the Mediterranean. Oh, and if you go all the way up, you'll see the Phoenicians, but they're really not part of the land of Canaan, so we won't be talking about them this time. Come on back down to Jericho, and you notice that below the Jebusites are the Hittites, the Kenites, and the Amalekites. Now, the Moabites are on the right side. They've already conquered part of those people as they have come up through that part of the country. But there are also some of those down there that they were not allowed to conquer because of the relationship God has with them through other family members. And we'll notice that as we go. Now the Amorites, let's talk about them for a minute. They were the strongest of the tribes. They controlled much of the Fertile Crescent. They had their stronghold in the east before the defeat of Sihon and Og, so they would have been primarily on the right side of the Jordan River, but they were also found on the west side, though in smaller numbers. Again, they were nomadic people. And so the Amorites, and that's when God had said to Abraham centuries before, the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. Now, they are first mentioned back in Genesis chapter 14, verse 7, and in Numbers 13, they're described as mountain dwellers. Probably the most notable king was Sihon, and he, remember, would not allow Israel to pass through his land, and so they went to war, and the Amorites lost, and so that was part of the possession that Israelites will have on the right side, the east side of the river Jordan. Well, then you have the Hittites. Well, they were very strong in the central hill country. And as we get into the invasion of the land, you'll find the central campaign will be the first thing they do, and the Hittites are there. But now we read about the Hittites back in the story of Abraham. If you were with us when we studied Genesis, we talked about Abraham, and remember he wanted to buy a cave as a burial site, and he ended up buying the cave of Machpelah from a Hittite. Now at that time they were not at war, there was no conflict, but the Hittites. Now the Hittites were at one time a very strong nation. Now there's ebb and flow as far as the strength of various nations at various times, and they actually had an empire. Here's a map that will show you that the Hittites at one time controlled much of what we now know as the nation of Turkey, all the way down to the land of Israel. And it was quite a large area, as you can see. Now there was times in history they were more powerful than at other times. The Hittites were an Indo-European people, and they established very powerful kingdoms in Asia Minor around 1740 to 1200 BC. Now Moses' day would be around the 1400 BC time frame. They were the descendants of Heth. They're usually mentioned in the same passages with the other nations that were hostile to Israel. They're not pictured as a group that were friendly people at all. And as we go back in the Bible story, we find that Esau married into the Hittite family. Remember Jacob and Esau? And you had Abraham, and then his son Isaac, and then you had Isaac, then had Jacob and Esau. They were twins. Esau married into this family, and Isaac and Rebekah were not happy about it at all. But that got them into that family. And in history now, there was a lot of information discovered about the Hittites in some cuneiform tablets by Hugo Winkler. And that was in the early 1900s near the Halys River. And so we know more about the Hittites than we do about some of the other people. And they had, again, their heyday was probably from 1800 to 1600 BC. Then there was a break in their power. They come back in around 1380 to 1200 BC. And then they had conflicts and fights with Egypt and over the control of the area, partly of Israel. And they had a lot to do with the area that's now known as Syria. Well, again, they because they were a power, then they come into conflict with another power who would be Egypt. And finally, there was some peace treaty between Ramses II of Egypt and Hattusilus, something like that, the third. And so it's just interesting that we do have a lot of history about these particular people. Now, another one of the tribes that they are going to conquer when they invade the land of Canaan were the Hivites or the Hivites. Now, they were a small, less powerful tribe, along with the Gergesites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites. And then the Gibeonites were part of this tribe. Keep that name in mind, the Gibeonites. We're going to find they might not have been very powerful, but they were pretty shrewd. And they are going to trick the children of Israel into entering into a covenant with them. And the children of Israel were not to enter any peace agreements with any of these people. But the Gibeonites, who are part of the Hivites, were going to do that very thing. Now, here we go back to our map, just to sort of see back to where we're looking now. Right above Jericho, there are the Hivites. And again, they were the early inhabitants of Syria and Palestine. Later, later they're going to be put to work as laborers for Solomon's building projects. As we get beyond the invasion and conquest of the land, then we come to the Judges, and then we come to the United Kingdom, Solomon being the last of the kings of the United Kingdom, and he has a lot of building projects, and the Hivites are going to be part of the workforce, of the slave force for that. Well, then we find the Jebusites. Now, the Jebusites are an interesting tribe to me. They control Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, you know, is a very important city in the scheme of things, even to this day. The Jebusites, they didn't call it Jerusalem, they called it Jebus. And they controlled Jerusalem even in the days of Joshua. And although they were sort of beat back somewhat, they were not conquered until the days of King David, many years later. And we'll see that as the story unfolds. So they were a very fierce people, but they had a stronghold in Jerusalem. A lot of the lay of the land made Jerusalem very difficult for an invading force to conquer. But we find David finally accomplished that in his time. Now, another interesting aspect about the inhabitants of the land, you had all these tribes that we've talked about, but they also had the giants. Remember when Moses sent the 12 spies to spy out the land, and they went and they looked and they said, oh, it's a wonderful land, truly a land flowing with milk and honey. But there are giants in the land. Now, they're called by different names, and they terrified the Israelites, the older generation, who have now died out, and the new generation is getting ready to go in, and they are much more fearless and more faithful overall generation than the previous one. But they're called, these giants were called by different names. The son of Anak, or the Anakim. Probably those are two of the more well-known names. The sons of Arba, the Rephaim, Eman, Zamzummim, Horites. Now, if I ask you to name a giant, name one of the giants, who might it be? Probably Goliath would come to mind, wouldn't he? David and Goliath, that's a story that we have heard from childhood, most likely. And that'll come about later. So you know, even in the days of David, and we have a long history to go yet before we get to David, there were still some giants around, not as many. Their numbers are dwindling. This Goliath was part of the Philistine army. And David, you know the story, is going to kill him, of course, through God's help. But he was one of the giants, over 9 feet tall. When we say giant, we're not talking, Jack and the Beanstalk giant. We're talking huge men, well over 9 feet tall. And there, you think about the people of the day probably were not 6 feet tall. And so there was a good bit of size difference between the two. And so that's just a little bit about the inhabitants now that are going to be faced as they invade and conquer the land. Now remember who's going to lead them. All this time we've studied about Moses. Now they have a new leader. Joshua. And Joshua is a good man. God would not have chosen him if not for that. We read about Joshua as we look at the book that bears his name, the book of Joshua. And I'm going to read an excerpt from Joshua that is sort of a taking of Joshua 1 and starting at verse 2 down through verse 9. God says to Joshua, "Arise, go over this Jordan, to the land which I am giving to the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon I have given you. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid nor be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." What wonderful words of assurance God is giving the young man Joshua. Yeah. It's sad that Moses is not able to go into the promised land. Remember, God allowed Moses to go up on the mountain there on the east side of the Jordan. He climbed up to a mountain we talked about last time, was taller than the mountains on the other side. Remember, the Jordan River was in a valley between two mountain ranges. And so Moses goes up to a higher point and he can look over and he can see the promised land, but he couldn't go in. Moses died on that mountain and God himself buried Moses. Before Moses went up there, though, he transferred his authority and part of his spirit over to Joshua. Well, Joshua now prepares the people to cross the Jordan. Remember, we talked about this earlier, and several things here now we've already talked about, so this will be a bit of a review. He sends 2 spies to Jericho. Now, those 2 spies, they were noticed, and somebody tells the king, and the king tries to find them. Well, they hide in the home of Rahab the harlot. And they have an agreement with Rahab that they will spare her and her family because of the kindness she showed the spies in hiding them. And so they tried to find them, they tried to find those 2 men. They couldn't find them. Those 2 men make it back in their report to Joshua and said, the people are scared to death. Their heart has melted because they have heard about this people that God is with and some of the great events in their history. And so now the people are moved now to Abel Shittim, which they're going to camp there about 3 days. And they're getting ready now, We're going to cross the Jordan. And so on the 10th day of the first month, they crossed the Jordan. Now this was during the flood season. Normally at this point, next to Jericho, they could fairly easily have crossed the Jordan River. But not during flood stage. It was some 12 feet deep and very swift current. But God said, "You're going to cross the Jordan. And I'm going to establish you, Joshua, in the sight of the people." And so you remember the story, how that the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant as they were supposed to on their shoulders, on those poles. And as soon as the soles of their feet touched the waters, then God stopped the water on one side. And it just sort of piled up. And the people crossed the Jordan on dry ground. Now this did not escape the notice of the people of the land. And their heart was even more afraid of this mass of people now that's invading their land. And so God has them to camp at Gilgal. Now there were some things that happened at Gilgal that we'll notice. In Joshua chapter 4 and in verse 14, "On that day the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they had feared Moses all the days of his life." Can you imagine? Here's a man that at his instructions, then they're crossing over to the promised land, and they cross on dry ground just as they had a generation before crossed the Red Sea on dry ground under the leadership of Moses. And so Joshua now is established in the sight of the people as a man to be believed and followed and feared. And that was necessary in the leadership of such a stubborn people. I like this map here, and I hope it shows up well for you. They crossed the Jordan, but notice now the topography of the land. I mentioned that the Jordan is in a valley, and you notice there's a mountain range on each side. And you see Jericho sort of not quite in the center of this map. And you notice now they're going to cross to the east, to the right, on the right side of Jericho. And so they have a lot of, descending and ascending to do, but you see the terrain there. And you can imagine, going back to Moses, how he could have looked over from one of those tall peaks and seen the promised land. And so it just helps me, and I hope it helps you to sort of get in mind what is going on now as they cross. And so here's an arrow here to kind of mark the spot of Gilgal. Now they've crossed the Jordan. They're going to camp at Gilgal. There are some things that have to be done first. Well, for one thing, God says, now, the men who have been born since you left Egypt have not been circumcised, and they need to be circumcised. And so they did that. And that was, God said that the reproach of Egypt has now been rolled away. And that's what Gilgal means, rolling away. Also, while at Gilgal, they observed the Passover on the 14th day of the first month, exactly 40 years to the day since the first Passover, when they ate the Passover and then left Egypt. Remember the 40 years, that was their punishment for not believing God the first time, when they should have already invaded and conquered the land 40 years ago. But because of their unbelief, they had to wander until that generation of soldiers had died out. Now, at Gilgal, they're going to eat the produce of the land. And as soon as they ate the produce of the land, the manna ceased. Remember the manna that God had been feeding them with almost all of this 40 years? And He had told them, when you get into the promised land, why, that you won't need this manna anymore. You'll eat of that land that flows with milk and honey. And so now, for the first time, in many of them's memory, there's no manna. When they get up in the morning, there's no manna. God had fed them all that time. And so the wandering now has ceased. The journey has ended. It's time to conquer the land. And it's a exciting time. It's a time that's going to try their faith. It's a time that they'll do some things right and some things they won't do right. But God will be with them. And you'll read passages like He sent the hornet before them to help drive out the inhabitants. And we'll see that the fear of them is going to be upon the people. Now, not that they won't meet resistance, but it won't be like when those 12 spies first went in there. It'll be different this time, and God is with them. And so, just as a little review here, since we've been doing some of that with Joshua already, and by the way, Joshua, let me say another thing or two about him. Joshua is a wonderful leader. He evidently is a great military leader. When he gets to the end of his life, Joshua looks at the people and he says, "Choose you this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Isn't that the attitude we ought to have? Can we look even at our own family? And Joshua was looking at his family and all of the children of Israel who were his extended family. And he said, "Now, you just choose who you're going to serve." And he goes on in that passage, I believe Joshua 24, verse 15. He said, "Whether it be the gods that our fathers served across the river, or the gods in whose land you dwell, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And so you can be like the people around you, Joshua says, or you can serve the true and living God. And let me challenge you to make that decision. You serve the Jehovah, the true and living God, no matter what people around you do. Choose you this day whom you will serve. Now remember where we are in our story. Remember, we started before the flood, and then the flood. Remember that? Sometime in our book now, it'll be called the creation. And that's fine. That's part of what happened before the flood, isn't it? And that's the main part of that story. But there was the creation, or before the flood, the flood. Well, remember that God had told the people after Noah and his the 7 people with him come out of the ark, and he says, I want you to be fruitful and multiply and fill the land. But they didn't want to do that. They decided they're going to stay pretty much right together. And so they started building a tower that reached to heaven. And the idea was that they could see that tower. As long as they could see that tower, they wouldn't get too far away from each other, and that's not what God wanted. So God came down and he confused the language, forcing them to scatter out and to sort of divide by language and scatter and fill the earth, as God had said to do to start with. And so you had before the flood, and the scattering of the people. And then we studied the patriarchs. Remember the patriarchs? The first Abraham, and then Isaac, and Jacob. And then remember, Jacob had 12 sons. One of those sons' name was Joseph. And it was through Joseph that they would eventually end up in the land of Egypt. But now, as you talk about those times, before the flood, scattering of the people, the patriarchs, those 4 categories take you through the book of Genesis. But then we come to the book of Exodus. And there we find God's people have multiplied tremendously. So much so that Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is afraid of them and he puts them in bondage. Well, eventually they cry out to God, and God sends Moses to deliver them. And so then we come to the Exodus. They are exiting Egypt, and that's what we have just recently, last time, studied. Well, they have the Exodus. They are headed for the promised land until they sin by not believing in God. And so you have the wandering in the wilderness. And again, that's the last thing that we've studied. And now we have come to the end of the wandering in the wilderness, and now we are poised for the invasion and conquest of the land. Now what you find is once the land is conquered, well, they sort of settle in. Joshua is going to die. The elders who serve with him are going to die. And then the period of time we call the judges comes about, because God is going to raise men up to serve as judges. And typically they would come up during a time of oppression. And what you have is the children of Israel will be faithful while there's a good judge. That judge will die, and then they'll become unfaithful. And then God will allow their enemies to rise up from within the promised land and afflict them. And they'll cry out again, and God will raise up another judge, and they'll subdue their enemies, and they'll be faithful for a while, and that just repeats itself back and forth. Well, so this is the current study guide that we have, is the invasion and conquest of the land and the time of the judges. Now, after the judges, the people are going to ask for a king. And you're going to have Saul and David and Solomon. And we call that the united kingdom. But then the kingdom is not going to stay united, and you have the divided kingdom. Well, from the divided kingdom, the northern half of that kingdom is going to be conquered, and that leaves the southern half, or Judah, alone. And so we had the wandering in the wilderness, and then we had the invasion and conquest of the land, and the judges, and then the united kingdom, and then the divided kingdom, and then Judah alone, and then we have the return. And then after they return from captivity, then we're going to find the years of silence, where there's no inspired writings, and then that is broken by the coming of Christ, and we have the life of Christ, and the letters then to the churches, to Christians, and we come all the way to the end of our Bible. There's 17 categories, and I'm glad that you're with us, and I hope that little review was helpful. Now, next time, as we study together, as you look at your study guide, we're going to talk about the conquest of the Central Hill Country, the Central Campaign, the Southern Campaign, and so we'll cover most of those campaigns in our next time together. Thank you for being with us. Continue to seek the old paths. A blind man sat by the road and he cried. A blind man sat by the road and he cried.
A blind man sat by the road and he cried, oh, 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 show me the way.